Okay, so we all come across this in some project, and it's getting the mortise set for these types of hinges. And yes, you could just easily measure out the hinge, put the lines, bring in a hand chisel and do it that way. But a much quicker and seems to me an easier way to do it is using a small trim router. Now, this is the small trim router that I use, and it'll help clear out the mortise area, and then you can come back and clean it up with a chisel. But there are some quick tips and tricks to this that actually makes this a better process. Now, the first trick is actually just using the trim router itself rather than a larger router, because when you come to the edges, it can rock back and forth. But we also have a system here that'll help alleviate that as well. We'll get back to that in a later step. But the biggest thing right here is using a smaller trim router. It's a little bit lighter in your hand and easier to control when you're cutting out your mortise. Now, another tip is getting this depth set right. I mean, you can try to eye it up and really see, it could be close or not, but it's actually a lot easier than that. And I'll show you this quick tip here. So what you can do is you can take your hinges and open them up and lay them on a nice flat surface. Here I'm using my workbench. Now you can bring your router over and easily place it down on the two hinges. Now you can set your depth to your router bit and know that it's set to the proper depth, so you're not going to overcut this. Now, earlier we were talking about how the router can easily tip on you, and that would cause gouges and your depth to be thrown off, and your mortise is not going to come out right. So one thing that we use to address this, not only when you use a bigger router if you don't have a small trim router, but also when it comes to the trim router itself, is I get a nice flat piece of scrap wood and I go ahead and I clamp it to the edge. Now what I'll go ahead and do is clamp both sides for myself, and then usually I'll just take a nice little hammer and just give it a little tap just to make sure it's nice and flush. Now when I come back with my router, you can see I have a bigger working surface that'll help support that and allow it to stabilize a little bit better for me, so I don't cause a quick tip or something like that and ruin a piece that's almost complete. Now some trim routers come with a fence that you can actually set to help the guide so that your trim router won't overcut and then leave you with an oversized mortise. Mine doesn't come with that, but you can easily do this by hand. One tip though is to actually use the router in a climbing motion when you're coming close to that line. Now this depth is very minimal, so you don't really have to worry as much about the router kicking or anything like that, because you are going in the opposite direction as the router bit is spinning. The reason why we do this and use a climbing technique rather than a push is when you do come and you push, that spinning router wants to walk the router up towards that line. Now you can do it, and I do it a lot, but you have to be very careful of that line. You don't want to go past it. So the climbing cut, meaning moving the router in that direction as the router bit spins, will allow you to maintain better control over it and get closer to that line. Now, either way that you do this, you want to make sure that you take your time and go slow. Make sure that you're watching where the router is at according to your line and making sure that you leave just a little bit left. Because the final step to this is we're going to come back with a nice sharp chisel and clean up and square up all those edges. This will allow the mortise to be perfectly square, and then your hinge will fit perfectly within that. Now the last thing that I advise when you're doing the mortise is to use these special spring-loaded centering bits. This makes sure that when I put this hole here, it's going to be in the dead center of the hinge. and that will allow you to make sure that the alignment's proper, and you're not going to have these screws that are bulging or anything like that, and the hinge will close perfectly fine. So if you like this tip, give it a thumbs up. We'd love to earn your subscription, and as always, thanks for buzzing by. Now you go make some dust.